All right. So the unit that we're starting next is called Intaglio. Intaglio is basically just a word, I believe it is Italian, but don't quote me on that, that means to etch into a plate. So there's different ways that you can accomplish Intaglio. The way that we're going to be doing it at school in this class is dry point etching. So basically, if you think about Intaglio as like the umbrella of a category, dry point etching just falls under that umbrella. There's different types of Intaglio. This is just one specific type of that. So dry point etching just means that we have a plastic plexiglass plate, which is what I'm showing you here, and it's the same plate that you used for your last project. We're going to continue to use that to move on to this next assignment. And you use a really sharp tool. This is called an etching stylus. The product name is actually really fun. They call it a twisted scribe. I love that because, like a scribe is to write, and it's got this like twisted grip on it. They're very, very sharp on both ends, so be careful with them. And you're going to use this to etch into this plexiglass plate. So what is it called? What's the term for when we show value by doing lines only? No smudging, no smearing, just by doing lines. What's that term? Don't even think about etching, just think about in drawing in general. Value by showing lines. Close lines, far apart lines to show different light and dark. It is a type of shading, but it's a little bit more specific. It's called hatching and cross hatching. You guys familiar with hatching and cross hatching? No? Okay. So it would be like, let me show you on a piece of paper so that you have an idea of what I'm talking about. I'm going to use a Sharpie to show you just so that you're able to see it really well on the screen. So if we were doing a value scale and we wanted to show light to dark using hatching or cross hatching, you basically do it by the width of the line that you're drawing and the closeness of that line to another line. So if I'm doing this, I'm creating kind of a lighter value. And if I start getting those lines closer together, that would maybe be more of a medium value, and then even closer together, touching almost a dark medium value, and then having those lines right on top of each other to the point that it's really just filling it in. That gives us a darker medium value. So do you guys understand the concept of hatching? All right, and then cross hatching is exactly the same thing, only instead of just having your lines going in one direction, the lines go across each other. And increasing closeness to show value. So you're not limited to show one or the other. It doesn't have to be that you use only hatching or only cross hatching. I think that there's good combinations of both in compositions. It's certainly okay to try to say, I'm going to try my best to do this whole composition only using hatching or cross hatching, but you don't have to. And the other thing that you want to think about with your lines is the direction of that line to help show texture. So if you can see in this is my plate that I'm going to print from. This is an actual print that's been printed from this plate already. I've used this plate in a demonstration before. You can see that, what would you describe? The majority of this is done using what? Hatching, right? Inside here, where it's super duper dark inside the mouth and inside the nose and inside the eyes, I did do some cross hatching to overlap and show like super duper duper dense dark value. But for the most part, I used hatching, but I made sure that I made the direction of the lines flow with the direction of the fur or the direction on the snout or on the tongue or on the teeth or whatever. Using the direction of that line is important to also help you show texture, which is going to be a big part of this assignment. So I've already etched this plate, obviously, but I did want to show it to you and just like the tools that you use. The idea is that the more you build up line, the more dark value that you're creating. So what is unique about this medium is that whenever this plate has been printed many, many, many times. So that's why it looks kind of red and you can see like the lines actually appearing dark. Oh, look at my fingernail, that's so gross. It's from the ink that you use on these plates, sorry. When you etch onto the plate, it actually, because you're scratching the surface of plastic, it's making a lighter mark. And that is confusing to flip your brain a little bit, because even though it looks light on the plate, it's going to print dark, because everywhere that you're etching a line into the plate, it's creating like a little hole that will hold ink. And the more lines you have and the deeper those lines are, the more ink that it's going to hold and the darker the value will appear. So even though while you're etching, it may look kind of white because of the way that the plastic changes color when it's scratched, but it actually will appear really dark when you print it the more that you go over an area. So you can bear down really hard to etch deeper lines that are going to make dark values, or you can just barely scratch the surface of it to show lighter lines. I gotta say, people do not love the noise of the way that it sounds when you etch onto the plastic. If that is something that bothers you, you may want to try wearing headphones while doing this project, because you can't avoid it. It just is what it is. Let me see if I can find a little area where I'll scratch something into it. I'll go up here on this edge. You're not gonna love the sound, so. So it's hard to see on the screen, but you can tell that, let me see if I can put something dark behind it. Well, I don't really even have anything dark, but it does make these whiter lines because they haven't been inked up yet. These lines are kind of white where I've etched onto the plate. So that's kind of the etching process. The other thing about this is, again, we are using a transparent plate. So my recommendation is that you fully draw out whatever it is that you're trying to portray, draw it completely, and then lay your plate on top of that reference image and etch on top of it so that you're just following your own reference. The reason for that is we're etching into a plate. This is not like doing the monotypes when you put the watercolor on it. When you've etched onto the plate, it's in there. You cannot get it out. Once you've etched a line, the line is in there forever. So having that fully developed reference photo underneath your plate is really helpful because it helps eliminate mistakes that you might make. Another example, so this would be a reference photo that I drew. You can see it fully this way. You can see it has a full range of value. You know, I shaded this whole thing with pencil before I even started etching, and this is also another really old and very, very, very dirty plate. But I took my plexiglass and I laid it directly on top of this, and I taped it to hold it in place while I was etching, and I etched using the stylus directly on top of my drawing to create these dark values, and then where I have these lighter values and textures on the actual skull, so that I created an etching that would print the same as my image. Following on process, you guys feel okay about that? All right. Oh shoot, I'm sorry. Okay, we do have time. So what I'm going to show you now is how we actually ink up this plate. It's very different from what we've done so far, and it's really the only process that works this way. I have for you guys some rubber gloves. You do not have to wear the gloves. If you feel like they kind of limit you, like your mobility and your dexterity, you don't have to wear them. This washes off of your hands, but you'll have nasty fingernails like me if you don't wear the gloves. So it's totally your call. I have a couple different sizes of gloves. I'll let you just hold on to them for the duration of the project so that you're only sharing germs with yourself, and then we'll, you know, swap around later. I'm gonna wear the gloves just for the demo. I normally don't wear them. I'm just a savage like that, but I'm wearing them for the demo. So what you're gonna need to ink up your plate is a piece of this plastic chipboard. You can use the paper chipboard as well. It doesn't really matter. They're all in that same drawer. And you need ink. We have a few different colors of Intaglio ink, but this particular project, you're only gonna use one color. You're not gonna be able to use multiple colors. So just decide what you think is gonna print best for you. Totally up to you. Then you're also going to need a piece of fabric. It is very dirty because we've used it for lots of projects before. I'll have like a big bin of them that you can use while you're wiping your plates. And then the last thing that you will need is a piece of phone book paper. Again, there will be phone books over there. You just tear out a piece of the paper. So I'm gonna go ahead and start my inking process. This is just like instantly messy. You can see the ink is very shiny. This one is getting close to empty, but there's still plenty in here for me to use. So I'm gonna start by just scooping out this amount of ink. And we want to use this as basically like a squeegee or a spatula to apply the ink on the surface of the plate. So if you have areas where you haven't etched anything, you don't have to worry about applying it to that area at all. But we're just trying to evenly hold it at kind of like a 45-degree angle and apply pressure and pull this ink across your plate so that it's getting pushed into all these little crevices that we've etched. That's the whole purpose of the inking of the plate process, is to push the ink into the areas you've etched. And we want to be able to spread it across as much as possible so that we're not wasting ink. You should be really scraping it across there so that the ink is being spread thin, because we're going to eventually wipe most of this ink off. All we're trying to do is get it into these lines that we've etched. So even when you think like, I don't know, it looks pretty thin, keep trying to spread it around your plate. You saw how much ink I had on my chipboard when I started, and I'm continuing to get this much of my plate covered. And this happens to be a plate that has a ton of etched lines in it. Some of them have a little bit less, just depending on the value and the texture of the object or thing that you're portraying. But on this one, I have a ton of etched lines, so there's lots of areas that I need to push the ink into. But again, like I said up here, I don't have anything, so it's not as important to cover those areas. But we really want to try not to waste the ink. It's not an incredibly affordable material, so we want to make sure that when we're using it, we're making the best of every inch of it. So I'm just going to get a little bit more. I'm not going to get quite as much as I got the first time because I have only this much plate left to cover. I already covered all this with my first swipe. So I'm going to try not to do that. That's wasteful. Pull it across these lines. I think I might have a little too much, so what I have on here right now, I'm just going to take the jar and scoop it back in. This ink is different than other inks that we use in printmaking because of the viscosity of the ink. Who can tell me, maybe a science person in here, what does viscosity mean? Anybody? Huh? The thickness, that's exactly right, you're right. Viscosity is how thick or thin something is. So this is a thinner ink because we want to be able to pull it around this plate and stick it into all those little lines that we etched. So right now, after I've covered everything, I'm going around and I'm pulling off any excess ink with this chipboard. This is kind of the beginning of the removing part. So we've added ink right now, up until now. Now we're gonna start kind of scraping off any extra that we can, gather up on this chipboard, and just kind of squishing it back into the ink container. All right, so next step, if you're using a piece of plastic chipboard, we do want to wash this chipboard and put it back into the drawer so we're not being wasteful. But right now we're done with this, so I'm going to set my chipboard to the side. Very messy. Put the lid back on the ink. Also, now the outside of this jar, I just washed it before this demonstration, but now the outside of this jar is covered in ink. That's just going to happen, so be prepared that, like, when you touch the jar, it's probably going to be dirty. I would recommend probably wearing an apron, or if you want to bring in like an oversized old t-shirt to wear while you're doing this, I would support that decision. So after we've inked it, we've scraped off any extra ink we can with the chipboard. The next step is to take the cloth. So this is step 2. After chipboard, then you go cloth. So you want to kind of if your cloth is flat, you want to kind of gather it up so that you've got a little flat surface of relatively clean cloth. Hold it from the back, and then you're going to hold your plate still and start to buff the ink off. And this step takes a while, but you can already start to see where the ink has gathered into those lines. This is going to make the cloth very, very dirty, and that's all right, because I am your laundry woman. I take these home and I wash them. So now that I've got a lot of ink on this one, I'm going to try to like twist it around and find a more clean spot. The wiping of the plate is really important because the wiping is what reveals the values. If you under wipe it, your values are all going to look way too dark and you're not going to be able to see any of the mediums or the light values that you've created. So it's really important that you're buffing in a circular motion on this plate to really define your values that you've created. So I'm rotating again to try to find a little bit of a clean spot, holding it. And you can see the more that I buff, the more these individual hairs are visible. And it really just looks like black lines, like almost like they were drawn with pen. So, like, for example, let's watch right here as I buff that. See how it kind of looks like a blob of black ink? Well, when I go in and I buff it, those individual lines become more defined. So that's why this step is so, so, so important. All right, I feel pretty confident about everything I have buffed so far, especially focusing on some of these areas, trying to get that out. Now we want to, at this point, you probably would want to go take your gloved hands to the sink, put some soap on like you're washing your hands, but with your gloves on. This is how we wash the gloves. Rub them together really good, rinse them, and even get a paper towel and dry them so that now your hands are clean, because there's so much ink on my hands that when I continue to touch this plate, I'm creating smudges, and we don't want to see those smudges. Nick. So but instead of me washing my hands, because that would make this demo even longer, I'm gonna just take the gloves off and raw hand it on here. Messy, messy, messy. But remember, the gloves are reusable. We're not throwing them away. So now that I've got like cleanish hands, I'm gonna pick this up so that I'm not putting any fingerprints on the plate. And see how there's ink all over the surface I've been wiping on? I'm gonna wipe the edges while I'm holding the plate to get any extra ink off front and back that I can see. All right. Last step, and this is just to sort of clean the plate up and just really define any values that we see. We're gonna take the newsprint and buff it on top in circular motions, just like we did with the cloth. Notice that I'm holding my plate underneath on this side, on the non-edged side. I'm holding it with this hand and buffing with the other hand so that it's not touching the dirty surface that I've been wiping on.